No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. Translated by Donald Keene, 1918. Read by Sleepless Tales. The Second Notebook. On the shore, at a point so close to the ocean, one might imagine it was there that the waves broke, stood a row of over 20 fairly tall cherry trees with coal-black trunks. Every April, when the new school year was about to begin, these trees would display their dazzling blossoms and their moist brown leaves against the blue of the sea. Soon, a snowstorm of blossoms would scatter innumerable petals into the water, flecking the surface with points of white, which the waves carried back to the shore. This beach, strewn with cherry blossoms, served as the playground of the high school I attended. Stylized cherry blossoms flowered even on the badge of the regulation school cap and on the buttons of our uniforms. A distant relative of mine had a house nearby, which was one reason why my father had especially selected for me this school of cherry blossoms by the sea. I was left in the care of the family, whose house was so close to the school that even after the morning bell had rung, I could still make it to my class on time if I ran. That was the kind of lazy student I was, but I nevertheless managed, thanks to my accustomed antics, to win popularity with my schoolmates. This was my first experience living in a strange town. I found it far more agreeable than my native place. One might attribute this, perhaps, to the fact that my clowning had by this time become such a part of me that it was no longer such a strain to trick others. I wonder, though, if it was not due instead to the incontestable difference in the problem involved in performing before one's own family and strangers, or in one's own town and elsewhere. This problem exists no matter how great a genius one may be. An actor dreads most the audience in his hometown. I imagine the greatest actor in the world would be quite paralyzed in a room where all his family and relatives were gathered to watch him. But I had learned to play my part. I had, moreover, been quite a success. It was inconceivable that so talented an actor would fail far away from home. The fear of human beings continued to writhe in my breast. I am not sure whether more or less intensely than before, but my acting talents had unquestionably matured. I could always convulse the classroom with laughter, and even as the teacher protested what a good class it would be if only I were not in it, he would be laughing behind his hand. At a word from me, even the military drill instructor, whose more usual idiom was a barbarous, thunderous roar, would burst into helpless laughter. Just when I had begun to relax my guard a bit, fairly confident that I had succeeded by now in concealing completely my true identity, I was stabbed in the back, quite unexpectedly. The assailant, like most people who stab in the back, bordered on being a simpleton, the puniest boy in class, whose scrofulous face and sloppy jacket with sleeves too long for him was complemented by a total lack of proficiency in his studies, and by such clumsiness in military drill and physical training that he was perpetually designated as an onlooker. Not surprisingly, I failed to recognize the need to be on my guard against him. That day, Takaichi, that was the boy's name, as I recall, was as usual onlooking during the physical training period, while the rest of us drilled on the horizontal bar. Deliberately assuming as solemn a face as I could muster, I lunged overhead at the bar, shouting with the effort. I missed the bar and sailed on as if I were making a broad jump, landing with a thud in the sand on the seat of my pants. This failure was entirely premeditated, but everybody burst out laughing, exactly as I had planned. I got to my feet with a rueful smile and was brushing the sand from my pants when Takaichi, who had crept up from somewhere behind, poked me in the back. He murmured, "You did it on purpose." I trembled all over. I might have guessed that someone would detect that I had deliberately missed the bar, but that Takaichi should have been the one came as a bolt from the blue. I felt as if I had seen the world before me burst in an instant into the raging flames of hell. It was all I could do to suppress a wild shriek of terror. The ensuing days were imprinted with my anxiety and dread. I continued on the surface, making everybody laugh with my miserable clowning. But now and then, painful sighs escaped my lips. Whatever I did, Takaichi could see through it, and I was sure he would soon start spreading the word to everyone he saw. At this thought, my forehead broke out in a sweat. I stared around me vacantly, with the wild eyes of a madman. If it were possible, I felt, I would like to keep a 24 hours a day surveillance over Takaichi, never stirring from him, morning, noon, or night, to make sure that he did not divulge the secret. I brooded over what I should do. I would devote the hours spent with him to persuading him that my antics were not on purpose, but the genuine article. If things went well, I would like to become his inseparable friend, but if this proved utterly impossible, I had no choice but to pray for his death. Typically enough, the one thing that never occurred to me was to kill him. During the course of my life, I have wished innumerable times that I might meet with a violent death, but I have never once desired to kill anybody. I thought that in killing a dreaded adversary, I might actually be bringing them happiness. In order to win over Takaichi, I clothed my face in the gentle, beguiling smile of the false Christian. I strolled everywhere with him, my arm lightly around his scrawny shoulders, my head tilted affectionately towards him. I frequently would invite him in honeyed, cajoling tones to come and play at the house where I was lodging. But instead of an answer, he always gave me only blank stares in return. One day, after school was let out, it must have been in early summer, there was a sudden downpour. The other students were making a great fuss about getting back to their lodgings, but since I lived just around the corner, I decided to make a dash for it. Just as I was about to rush outside, I noticed Takaichi hovering dejectedly in the entranceway. I said, "Let's go. I'll lend you my umbrella." I grabbed Takaichi's hand as he hesitated, and ran out with him into the rain. When we arrived home, I asked my aunt to dry our jackets. I had succeeded in luring Takaichi to my room. The household consisted of my aunt, a woman in her 50s, and my two cousins, the older of whom was a tall, frail, bespectacled girl of about 30. She had been married at one time, but was later separated. And the younger, a short, round-faced girl who looked fresh out of high school. The ground floor of the house was given over to a shop where small quantities of stationery supplies and sporting goods were offered for sale, but the principal source of income was the rent from the 5 or 6 tenants that were built by my late uncle. Takaichi, standing haplessly in my room, said, "My ears hurt." "They must have got wet in the rain." I examined his ears and discovered they were both running horribly. The lobes seemed filled to bursting with pus. I simulated an exaggerated concern. "This looks terrible. It must hurt." Then, in the gentle tones a woman might use, I apologized. "I'm so sorry I dragged you all out into the rain." I went downstairs to fetch some cotton wool and alcohol. Takaichi lay on the floor with his head on my lap, and I painstakingly swabbed his ears. Even Takaichi seemed not to be aware of the hypocrisy, the scheming behind my actions. Far from it. His comment as he lay there with his head pillowed in my lap was, "I'll bet lots of women will fall for you." It was his illiterate approximation of a compliment. This, I was to learn in later years, was a kind of demonical prophecy, more horrible than Takaichi could have realized. To fall for, to be fallen for. I feel in these words something unspeakably vulgar, farcical, and at the same time, extraordinarily complacent. Once these expressions put in an appearance, no matter how solemn the place, The silent cathedrals of melancholy crumble, leaving nothing but an impression of fatuitousness. It was curious, but the cathedrals of melancholy were not necessarily demolished if one can replace the vulgar, "what a messy business it is to be fallen for," by the more literary, "what uneasiness lies in being loved." Takaichi uttered that idiotic compliment, that women would fall for me, because I had been kind enough to clean the discharge from his ears. My reaction at the time was merely to blush and smile, without saying a word in return, but to tell the truth, I already had a faint inkling of to what his prophecy implied. No, to speak in those terms of the atmosphere engendered by so vulgar an expression as "to fall for" is to portray a precocity of sentiment not even worthy of the dialogue of the romantic lead in a musical comedy. I certainly was not moved by the farcical, self-satisfied emotions suggested by the phrase, "to have a faint inkling." I have always found the female of the human species many times more difficult to understand than the male. In my immediate family, women outnumbered the men, and many of my cousins were girls. There was also the maidservant of the crime. I think it would be no exaggeration to say that my only playmates while I was growing up were girls. Nevertheless, it was with very much the sensation of treading on thin ice that I associated with these girls. I almost could never guess their motives. I was in the dark. At times, I made indiscreet mistakes which brought me painful wounds. These wounds, unlike the scars from the lashing a man might give, cut inwards, very deep, like an internal hemorrhage, bringing intense discomfort. Once inflicted, it was extremely hard to recover from such wounds. Women led me on only to throw me aside. They mocked and tortured me when others were around, only to embrace me with passion as soon as everyone had left. Women sleep so soundly, they seem to be dead. Who knows? Women may live in order to sleep. These and the various other generalizations were products of an observation of women since boyhood days. But my conclusion was that though women appear to belong to the same species as man, they are actually quite different creatures. And these incomprehensible, insidious beings have, fantastic as it seems, always looked after me. But in my case, such an expression as "to be fallen for" or even "to be loved" is not in the least appropriate. Perhaps it describes a situation more accurately to say that I was looked after. Women were also less demanding than men when it came to clowning. When I played the jester, men did not go on laughing indefinitely. I knew that if I got carried away by my success in entertaining a man and overdid the role, my comedy would fall flat, and I was always careful to quit at a suitable place. Women, on the other hand, have no sense of moderation. No matter how long I went on with my antics, they would ask for more, and I would become exhausted responding to their insatiable demands for the encores. They really laugh an amazing amount of the time. I suppose one can say that women stuff themselves with far more pleasures than men. The two cousins in whose house I was living while attending school used to visit my room whenever they had the time. Their knock on my door, no matter how often it came, never failed to startle me, so that I almost jumped in fright. "Are you studying?" "No," I would say with a smile, shutting my book. I would launch into some silly story miles removed from what I was thinking. "Today at school, the geography teacher, the one we call Walrus," so on, so on. One evening, my cousins came to my room, and after they had compelled me to clown at unmerciful lengths, one of them proposed, "Yozo, let's see how you look with glasses on." "Why?" "Don't make such a fuss. Put them on. Here, take these glasses." They invariably spoke in the same harsh, peremptory tones. The clown meekly put on the older girl's glasses. My cousins were convulsed with laughter. "You look exactly like him, exactly like Harold Lloyd." The American movie comedian was very popular at the time in Japan. I stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, raising one arm in greeting, "I should like on this occasion to thank all my Japanese fans." I went through the motions of making a speech. They laughed, all the harder. From then on, whenever a Harold Lloyd movie came into town, I went to see it and secretly studied his expressions. One autumn evening, as I was lying in bed reading a book, the older of my cousins, I always called her sister, suddenly darted into my room, quick as a bird, and collapsed over my bed. She whispered through her tears, "Yozo, you'll help me. I know you will. Let's run away from this terrible house together. Oh, help me, please." She continued in this hysterical vein for a while, only to burst into tears again. This was not the first time that a woman had put such a scene before me, and sister's excessively emotional words did not surprise me much. I felt instead a certain boredom at their banality and emptiness. I slipped out of bed, went to my desk, and picked up a persimmon. I peeled it and offered sister a section. She ate it, still sobbing, and said, "Have you any interesting books? Lend me something." I chose Soseki's "I Am a Cat" from my bookshelf and handed it to her. "Thanks for the persimmon," sister said as she left the room, an embarrassed smile on her face. Sister was not the only one. I have often felt that I would find it more complicated, troublesome, and unpleasant to ascertain the feelings by which a woman lives than to plumb the innermost thoughts of an earthworm. Long personal experience had taught me that when a woman suddenly bursts into hysterics, the way to restore her spirits is to give her something sweet. Her younger sister, Sechan, would even bring friends to my room. And in the usual fashion, I amused them all with perfect impartiality. As soon as a friend had left, Sechan would tell me disagreeable things about her, inevitably concluding, "She's a bad girl. You must be careful of her." If that's the case, I wanted to say, you didn't need to have gone through all the trouble of bringing her here. Thanks to Sechan, almost all the visitors to my room were girls. This, however, by no means implies that Takaichi's compliment, "Women'll fall for you," had as yet been realized. I was merely the Harold Lloyd of Northeast Japan. Not for some years would Takaichi's silly statement come palpitatingly alive, metamorphosed into a sinister prophecy. Takaichi made one other important gift to me. One day, he came to my room to play. He was waving a brightly colored picture, which he proudly displayed. "It's a picture of a ghost," he explained. I was startled. That instant, as I could not help feeling in later years, determined my path of escape. I knew what Takaichi was showing me. I knew that it was only the familiar self-portrait of Van Gogh. When we were children, the French Impressionist school was very popular in Japan, and our first introduction to an appreciation of Western painting most often began with such works. The paintings of Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne, and Renoir were familiar enough to students at country schools, mainly through photographic reproductions. I myself had seen quite a few colored photographs of Van Gogh's paintings. His brushwork and the vividness of his colors had intrigued me, but I had never imagined his pictures to be of ghosts. I took from my bookshelf a volume of Modigliani's reproductions and showed Takaichi the familiar nudes with skin the color of burnished copper. "How about these? Do you suppose they're ghosts too?" "They're terrific!" Takaichi widened his eyes in admiration. "This one looks like a horse out of hell." "They really are ghosts then, aren't they?" "I wish I could paint pictures of ghosts like that," said Takaichi. There are some people whose dread of human beings is so morbid that they reach a point where they yearn to see with their own eyes monsters of ever more horrible shapes. And the more nervous they are, the quicker to take fright, the more violent they pray that every storm will be. Painters who have had this mentality, after repeated wounds and intimidations at the hand of the apparitions called human beings, have often come to believe that phantasms, they plainly saw monsters in broad daylight in the midst of nature. And they did not fob people off with clowning. They did their best to depict these monsters just as they had appeared, Takaichi was right. They had dared to paint pictures of devils. These, I thought, would be my friends in the future. I was so excited, I could have wept. I'm going to paint too. I'm going to paint pictures of ghosts and devils and horses out of hell. My voice as I spoke these words to Takaichi was lowered to a barely audible whisper. Why? I don't know. Ever since elementary school days, I enjoyed drawing and looking at pictures. But my pictures failed to win the reputation among my fellow students that my comic stories did. I've never had the least trust in the opinions of human beings, and my stories represented to me nothing more than the clown's gesture of greeting to his audience. They enraptured all of my teachers, but for me, they were devoid of the slightest interest. Only to my paintings, to the depiction of the object, my cartoons were something else again. Did I devote any real efforts of my original, though childish style? The copybooks for drawing we used at school were dreary. The teachers' pictures were incredibly inept, and I was obliged to experiment for myself, entirely without direction, using every method of expression which came to me. I owned a set of oil paints and brushes from the time I entered high school. I sought to model my techniques on those of the Impressionist school, but my pictures remained flat as paper cutouts, and seemed to offer no promise of ever developing into anything. But Takaichi's words made me aware that my mental attitude towards painting had been completely mistaken. What superficiality and what stupidity there's in trying to depict in a pretty manner things which one has thought pretty. The masters, through their subjective perceptions, created beauty out of trivialities. They did not hide their interest even in things which were nauseatingly ugly, but soaked themselves in the pleasure of depicting them. In other words, they seemed not to rely on the least on the misconceptions of others. Now that I had been initiated by Takaichi into these root secrets of the art of painting, I began to do a few self-portraits, taking care that they not be seen by my female visitors. The pictures I drew were so heartrending as to stupefy even myself. Here was the true self I had so desperately hidden. I had smiled cheerfully. I had made others laugh. But this was the harrowing reality. I secretly affirmed this self, was sure that there was no escape from it. But naturally, I did not show my pictures to anyone except Takaichi. I disliked the thought that I might suddenly be subjected to their suspicious vigilance, when once the nightmarish reality under the clowning was detected. On the other hand, I was equally afraid that they might not recognize my true self when they saw it, but imagined that it was just some new twist on my clowning. Occasion for additional snickers. This would have been the most painful of all. I therefore hid the pictures in the back of my cupboard. In school drawing classes, I also kept secret my ghost-style techniques and continued to paint as before in the conventional idiom of pretty things. To Takaichi, and to him alone, I could display my easily wounded sensibilities, and I did not hesitate now to show him my self-portraits. He was very enthusiastic, and I painted 2 or 3 more, plus a picture of a ghost, earning from Takaichi the prediction, "You'll be a great painter someday." Not long afterwards, I went up to Tokyo. On my forehead were imprinted the 2 prophecies uttered by half-wit Takaichi, that I would be fallen for, and that I would become a great painter. I wanted to enter art school, but my father put me into college, intending eventually to make a civil servant out of me. This was the sentence passed on me, and I, who have never been able to answer back, dumbly obeyed. At my father's suggestion, I took the college entrance examinations a year early, and I passed. By this time, I was really quite weary of my high school by the sea and the cherry blossoms. Once in Tokyo, I immediately began life in the dormitory, but the squalor and violence appalled me. This time, I was in no mood for clowning. I got the doctor to certify that my lungs were affected. I left the dormitory and went to live in my father's townhouse in Ueno. Communal living had proved quite impossible for me. It gave me chills just to hear such words as the ardor of youth or youthful pride. I could not by any stretch of the imagination soak myself in college spirit. The classrooms and the dormitory seemed like the dumping grounds of distorted sexual desires, and even my virtually perfected antics were of no use here. When the diet was not in session, my father spent only a week or two of the month at the house. While he was away, there would be just the three of us in the rather imposing mansion, an elderly couple who looked after the premises and myself. I frequently cut classes, but not because I felt like sightseeing in Tokyo. It looks as if I shall end my days without ever having seen the Meiji Shrine, the statue of Kusunoki Masashige, or the tombs of the 47 Ronin. Instead, I would spend whole days in the house reading and painting. When my father was in town, I set out for school promptly every morning, although sometimes I actually went to an art class given by a painter in Hongo, and I practiced sketching for 3 or 4 hours at a time with him. Having been able to escape from the college dormitory, I felt rather cynically. This may have been my own bias, that I was now in a rather special position. Even if I attended lectures, it was more like an auditor than a regular student. Attending classes became all the more tedious. I had gone through elementary and high schools and was now in college without ever having been able to understand what was meant by school spirit. I had never even tried to learn the school songs. Before long, a student at the art class was to initiate me into the mysteries of drink, cigarettes, prostitutes, pawn shops, and left-wing thought. A strange combination. And it actually happened that way. The student's name was Masao Horiki. He had been born in downtown Tokyo, was 6 years older than myself, and was a graduate of a private art school. Having no atelier at home, he used to attend the art class I frequented, where he was supposedly continuing his study of oil painting. One day, when we still barely knew each other by sight, we hadn't yet exchanged a word, he suddenly said to me, "Can you lend me 5 yen?" I was so taken aback that I ended up giving him the money. That's fine, he said. "Now for some liquor. You're my guest." I couldn't very well refuse, and I was dragged off to a cafe near the school. This marked the beginning of our friendship. "I've been noticing you for some while. There, that bashful smile, that's the special mark of a promising artist. Now, as a pledge of our friendship, bottoms up." He called one of the waitresses to our table. "Isn't he a handsome boy? You mustn't fall for him now. I'm sorry to say it, but ever since he appeared in our art class, I've only been around the second handsomest." Horiki was swarthy, but his features were regular and most unusual for an art student. He always wore a neat suit and a conservative necktie. His hair was pomaded and parted in the middle. The surroundings were unfamiliar to me. I kept folding and unfolding my arms nervously, and my smiles now were really bashful. In the course of drinking 2 or 3 glasses of beer, however, I began to feel a strange lightness of liberation. I started, "I've been thinking, I'd like to enter a real art school." "Don't be silly. They're useless. Schools are all useless. The teachers who immerse themselves in nature. The teachers who show profound sympathy for nature." I felt not the least respect for his opinions. I was thinking, he's a fool and his paintings are rubbish, but he might be a good person for me to go out with. For the first time in my life, I had met a genuine city good-for-nothing, no less than myself, though in a different way. He was entirely removed from the activities of the human beings of the world. We were of one species, if only in that we were both disoriented. At the same time, there was a basic difference in us. He operated without being conscious of his fractiality, or, for that matter, without giving any recognition to the misery of that fractiality. I despised him as one fit only for amusement, a man with whom I associated for that sole purpose. At times, I even felt ashamed of our friendship. But in the end, as a result of going out with him, even Horiki proved too strong for me. At first, however, I was convinced that Horiki was a nice fellow, an unusually nice fellow. And despite my habitual dread of human beings, I relaxed my guard to the extent of thinking that I had found a fine guide to Tokyo. To tell the truth, when I first came to the city, I was afraid to board a streetcar because of the conductor. I was afraid to enter the Kabuki Theater for fear of the usherettes standing along the sides of the red-carpeted staircase at the main entrance. I was afraid to go into a restaurant because I was intimidated by the waiters furtively hovering behind me, waiting for my plate to be emptied. Most of all, I dreaded paying a bill. My awkwardness when I handed over the money after buying something did not arise from any stinginess, but from excessive tension, excessive embarrassment, excessive uneasiness and apprehension. My eyes would swim in my head, and the whole world would grow dark before me, so that I felt half out of my mind. There was no question of bargaining. Not only did I have to forget to pick up my change, but I quite frequently forgot to take home the things that I had purchased. It was quite impossible for me to make my way around Tokyo by myself. I had no choice but to spend whole days at a time lolling around the house. So I turned my money over to Horiki, and the two of us went out together. He was a great bargainer, and this perhaps earned him the ranking of expert in pleasure-seeking. He displayed unusual proficiency in spending minimal sums of money with maximum effects. His talents extended to getting wherever he wanted in the shortest possible time without ever having recourse to taxis. He used by-turns, as seemed appropriate, the streetcar, the bus, and even steam launches in the river. He gave me a practical education. Thus, if we stopped in the morning at a certain restaurant on our way home from a prostitute's and had a bath with our meal, it was a cheap way of experiencing the sensation of living luxuriously. He also explained that beef with rice or skewered chicken, the sort of dishes you can get at a roadside stand, are cheap but nourishing. He guaranteed that nothing got you drunker quicker than brandy. At any rate, as far as the bill was concerned, he never caused me to feel the least anxiety or fear. Another thing which saved me when with Horiki was that he was completely uninterested in what his listener might be thinking, and could pour forth a continuous stream of nonsensical chatter 24 hours a day, in whichever direction the eruption of his passions led him. It may have been that his passions consisted in ignoring the feelings of his listener. His loquacity ensured that there would be absolutely no danger of our falling into uncomfortable silences when our pleasures had fatigued us. In dealings with other people, I had often been on my guard lest these frightful silences occur. But since I was naturally slow of speech, I could only stave them off by a desperate recourse to clowning. Now, however, that stupid Horiki, quite without realizing it, was playing the part of the clown, and I was under no obligation to make appropriate answers. It sufficed if I merely let the stream of his words flow through my ears, and once in a while commented with a smile, "Not really." I soon came to understand that drink, tobacco, and prostitutes were all excellent means of dissipating, even for a few moments, my dread of human beings. I came even to feel that if I had to sell every last possession to obtain these means of escape, it would be well worth it. I never could think of prostitutes as human beings, or even as women. They seemed more like imbeciles or lunatics. But in their arms, I felt absolute security. I could sleep soundly. It was pathetic how utterly devoid of greed they really were. And perhaps because they felt for me something like an affinity for their kind. These prostitutes always showed me a natural friendliness, which never became oppressive. Friendliness with no ulterior motive. Friendliness stripped of high-pressure salesmanship for someone who might never come again. Some nights I saw these imbecile, lunatic prostitutes with the halo of Mary. I went to them to escape from my dread of human beings, to seek a mere night of repose. But in the process of diverting myself from these kindred prostitutes, I seem to have acquired, before I was aware of it, a certain offensive atmosphere which clung inseparably to me. This was quite unexpected byproduct of my experience, but gradually it became more manifest until Horiki pointed it out. To my amazement and consternation, I had quite, objectively speaking, passed through an apprenticeship in women at the hands of prostitutes, and I had of late become quite adept. The severest apprenticeship in women, they say, is with prostitutes, and that makes it the most effective. The odor of the lady killer had come to permeate me, and women, not only prostitutes, instinctively detected it and flocked to me. This obscene and inglorious atmosphere was the bonus I received, and it was apparently far more noticeable than recuperative effects of my apprenticeship. Horiki informed me of it half as a compliment, I suppose, but it struck a painful chord in me. I remembered now clumsily written letters from bar girls and the general's daughter, a girl of 20 whose house was next to mine, and who every morning when I went to school was always hovering around her gate, all dressed up for no apparent reason. And the waitress at the steak restaurant who, even when I didn't say a word, and the girl at the tobacco shop I patronized who always would put in the package of cigarettes she handed me, and the woman in the seat next to mine at the Kabuki Theater, and the time when I was drunk and fell asleep on the streetcar in the middle of the night, and that letter burning with passion that came unexpectedly from a girl relative in my country, and the girl, whoever it was, who left a doll, one she had made herself for me when I was away. With all of them, I had been extremely negative, and the stories had gone no further, remaining undeveloped fragments. But it was an undeniable fact, and not just some foolish delusion on my part, that there lingered about me an atmosphere which could send women into sentimental reveries. It caused me a bitterness akin to shame to have this pointed out by someone like Horiki. At the same time, I suddenly lost all interest in prostitutes. To show off his modernity, I can't think of any other reason, Horiki also took me one day to a secret communist meeting. I don't remember exactly what it was called, a reading society, I think. A secret communist meeting may have been for Horiki just one more night of the sights of Tokyo. I was introduced to the comrades and obliged to buy a pamphlet. I then heard a lecture on Marxian economics delivered by an extraordinarily ugly young man, the guest of honor. Everything he said seemed exceedingly obvious and undoubtedly true, but I felt sure that something more obscure, more frightening, lurked in the hearts of human beings. Greed did not cover it, nor did vanity, nor was it simply a combination of lust and greed. I wasn't sure what it was, but I felt that there was something inexplicable at the bottom of human society which was not reducible to economics. Terrified as I was by this weird element, I assented to materialism as naturally as water finding its own level. But materialism could not free me from my dread of human beings. I could not feel the joy of hope a man experiences when he opens his eyes on young leaves. Nevertheless, I regularly attended the meetings of the Reading Society. I found it uproariously amusing to see my comrades, their faces tense, as though they were discussing matters of life and death, absorbed in the study of theories so elementary they were on the order of 1 and 1 makes 2. I tried to take some of the strain out of the meetings with my usual antics. That was why, I imagine, the oppressive atmosphere of the group gradually relaxed. I came to be so popular that I was considered indispensable at the meetings. These simple people perhaps fancied that I was just as simple as they, an optimistic, laughter-loving comrade. But if such was their view, I was deceiving them completely. I was not their comrade. Yet I attended every single meeting and performed for them my full repertory of farce. I did it because I liked to, because these people pleased me, and not necessarily because they were linked by any common affection derived from Marx. Irrationality. I found the thought faintly pleasurable, or rather, I felt at ease with it. What frightened me was the logic of the world. In it lay the foretaste of something incalculably powerful. Its mechanism was incomprehensible, and I could not possibly remain closeted in that windowless, bone-chilling room. Though outside lay the sea of irrationality, it was far more agreeable to swim in its waters until presently I drowned. People talk of social outcasts. The words apparently denote the miserable losers of the world, the vicious ones. But I feel as though I have been a social outcast from the moment I was born. If ever I meet someone society has designated as an outcast, I invariably feel affection for him, an emotion which carries me away in melting tenderness. People also talk of criminal consciousness. All my life in this world of human beings, I've been tortured by such consciousness, but it has been my faithful companion, like a wife in poverty. And together, just the two of us, we have indulged in our forlorn pleasures. This, perhaps, has been one of the attitudes in which I have gone on living. People also commonly speak of the wound of the guilty consciousness. In my case, the wound appeared of itself when I was an infant, and with the passage of time, far from healing, it has grown only deeper, until now it has reached the bone. The agonies I have suffered night after night have made for a hell composed of an infinite diversity of tortures. But though, this is a very strange way to put it, the wound has gradually become dearer to me than my own flesh and blood. And I have thought its pain to be the emotion of the wound as it lived, or even its murmur of affection. For such a person as myself, the atmosphere of an underground movement was curiously soothing and agreeable. What appealed to me, in other words, was not so much its basic aims as its personality. The movement served Horiki merely as a pretext for idiotic banter. The only meeting he attended was the one where he introduced me. He gave me his reason for not coming again, the stupid joke that Marxists study not only the productive aspects of society, but the consumptive ones. At any rate, the consumptive aspects were the only ones we observed together. When I think back on it now, in those days, there were Marxists of every variety. Some, like Horiki, called themselves such out of an emptied modernity. An attraction for its odor of irrationality led others, like myself, to participate in the movement. I am sure that if the true believers in Marxism had discovered what Horiki and I were really interested in, they would have been furious with us and driven us out immediately as vile traitors. Strange to say, however, neither Horiki nor I ever became close to being expelled. On the contrary, I felt so much more relaxed in this irrational world than in the world of rational gentlemen that I was able to do what was expected of me in a sound manner. I was therefore considered a promising comrade and entrusted with various jobs fraught with a ludicrous degree of secrecy. As a matter of fact, I never once refused any of their jobs. Curiously docile, I performed whatever they asked of me, with such unruffled assurance that the dogs, that was the name which the comrades referred to the police, suspected nothing, and I was never so much as picked up for questioning. Smiling, making others smile, I punctiously acquitted myself of all their dangerous missions. The people in the movement observed such excessive precautions that they were perpetually prey to life and death tensions, as to suggest some clumsy imitation of a detective novel. The missions on which I was employed were really of a stupefying inconsequentiality, but the comrades kept themselves worked up into a state of frantic excitement by incessantly reminding themselves how dangerous these errands were. I felt at the time that if I should become a party member and got caught, not even the prospect of spending the rest of my life in prison would bother me. It occurred to me that prison life might actually be pleasanter than groaning away my sleepless nights in a hellish dread of the realities of life, as led by human beings. Page 70. Going to take a break from this one. See you in part 2 of chapter 2 of No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai, translated by Donald Keene, read by Sleepless Tales.